Hello again, Steven. I got a new camera. The Sony a6500. Like I said, I got a new camera, so today I'm going to be talking about the camera that I'm coming from, the camera that I chose, and why I chose this camera as a replacement for my current one. But now that I've actually shown you this, I can put my new camera on the tripod and take my old camera off, so let's do that. Oh, okay. New camera. So I can't talk about the camera I chose without telling you what camera I came from. So for the past 4 years, I've been shooting with the Nikon D5200. This was the first real in quotes camera I got. I did a lot of research before getting this camera, but the problem was that I didn't know what I was researching. I didn't know what I wanted in a camera. And I've really enjoyed having this camera, but 4 years later, I'm looking to upgrade a little bit. Also, this camera takes great pictures, but it's not particularly good for video. The autofocus on this camera is not good. It's not too bad when you're taking pictures, but when you leave this on continuous autofocus when you're taking video, if the subject moves or if you move the camera just slightly while you're taking the video, the camera will defocus and then refocus. So when getting a camera, I had to consider two things: my needs and my budget. When I got the Nikon, I thought I was primarily getting it to take pictures, and then years later I find that I'm actually taking about as many videos as I take pictures. So in a new camera I need something that works well as a hybrid camera. Now for video, I'm buying a camera in 2019, so if I don't buy one with 4K and with 120 frames per second, at least on an HD option, then the camera I'm buying is pretty much already outdated. Also, it has to have great autofocus. I want to be able to shoot videos like this where I can just turn the camera on and record without having to worry about whether I'm staying in focus or not. And also I want image stabilization. Opinions differ as to whether image stabilization actually helps footage, but I don't care. I want a camera that has image stabilization in the body. So with that in mind, I listed all of the cameras that had the specs of a camera that I would want and maybe might consider buying. From Canon, the 1DX Mark II, the EOS R, and the M50. From Nikon, the Z6 and the Z7. From Sony, the a6400, the a6500, the a7 III, the a7S II, the a7R3, a7R4, and a9. From Fujifilm, the X-T30 and the X-T3 and the XH1. From Panasonic, they have their Lumix line with the G9, the G9 V, the GH5, and the S1. I looked at Olympus too, but they didn't really have any cameras that had specs that I wanted. So right off the bat, I said one of my considerations was budget, and several of these cameras are way out of my price range. With that in mind, we are going to knock off the 1DX Mark II from Canon, the Nikon Z7. From Sony, we can knock off the a7S II, the a7R3, the a7R4, and the a9. And from Panasonic, we can knock off the S1. Talking about the two other Canon cameras, the EOS R is a great camera, but it doesn't really have the specs I want, especially at the price range that it's at, so that's out. The M50 is a very cheap and affordable option, and one that I looked at in depth, but I looked at some of the image quality out of the camera and I wasn't very impressed, so that was out as well. From Nikon, the Z6, a great camera, great specs, not too bad of a price point, so I kept that on the list. I took off the Sony a6400 because it didn't have image stabilization, and I kept both the Sony a6500 and the Sony a7 III. The Fuji cameras, both the X-T30 and the X-T3 do not have image stabilization. I kept the XH1 on the list. In terms of Panasonic, there are a lot of people online that talk about how good the Panasonic Lumix cameras are. The problem with the Panasonic cameras is that all of them have the micro four thirds image sensor. People say these cameras are amazing and they say that the sensor size does not really matter in terms of what picture quality you can get, but I really didn't want to get a new camera where I'm investing in a lens system that is a smaller sensor than what I already have. So for that reason, that's why I took all of the Panasonic cameras off the list. So that leaves us now with 4 cameras that I was considering: the Sony a6500, the Sony a7 III, the Fujifilm X-H1, and the Nikon Z6. The Fujifilm is slightly more expensive than the Sony a6500, and they have almost identical specs. Fuji is supposed to be really great for video, but Sony has a reputation for having one of the best autofocus systems out there. So comparing them side by side, I decided to stick with the a6500 over the Fujifilm X-H1. The Nikon Z6 and the a7 III are almost identical when it comes to specs. Also, they're almost identical when it comes to price. The reason I took the Z6 off the list and kept the a7 III is that I like the lens selection a little bit better when it comes to the Sony full-frame cameras, and the a7 III has a slightly better autofocus system than the Z6. So that leaves us with the a6500 and the a7 III. The a7 III is obviously the better camera of the two. It's full frame, it has almost identical specs. People love the a7 III. They call it one of the best cameras out there. The problem is the price. List price, you're talking about $1,200 for the a6500 and $2,000 for the a7 III. I spent a lot of time considering between these two cameras because on one hand, I want to get the best camera I can, so is it worth it to spend a little bit more money to take a little bit more time to save up the money to get an a7 III? Or should I get the a6500, which has every spec that I need? I chose the a6500 in the end, honestly because I read a comment on one YouTube video that changed my perspective. The a7 III is for professionals, the a6500 is for enthusiasts. I'm not a professional photographer. I do not make a dime off of my photos, and I don't even use my camera on a daily basis. In the end, obviously I decided to go with the 6500, and I am extraordinarily happy with my decision so far. If I'm cutting off the video now, that means I went a little bit long in what I was wanting to talk about. So in that case, I will make a separate video talking about my experience with the 6500. So if I'm wrapping this up now, Steven, that means I'm out of time. So I will just say talk to you later. Bye.